Hello again, I am Blunty. So we've known a new model, a revision as such of the PlayStation 5 has been coming for a little while now. It first came out that it was going to be a little bit lighter. No one could quite explain why, because it looked exactly the same. And then they started hitting shelves here in Australia first, believe it or not. And then predictably enough, one of the large TechTuber type channels got hold of one, pulled it apart, did a comparison with the old one to find out exactly what the difference was and does it make a difference. That YouTuber was Austin Evans, which I'm sure if you've watched some of my videos, you'll have certainly seen some of his along the way. So he got his hands on one, he set it up side by side with a launch console and tested the sort of thermal output using a thermal camera pointed at the back vent, which is not really the best way to do that, but whatever, it'll do for comparison's sake, I suppose. And then he pulled it apart and had a look, and oh, the heatsink's way different. There's a teeny tiny, comparatively speaking, heatsink on the new model versus the big, bulky, sort of confidence-inducing and back-breaking heatsink that was on the original model. And predictably enough, the smaller, pathetic heatsink on the new model doesn't do a good a job, so it runs hotter. But then, predictably enough, a few days after that panic started to thread through the gamer community, here comes the Sony's pet journalists who Sony have no doubt tapped on the shoulder and said, hey, you wanna do some counter arguments for this? I'm not saying this particular person is being paid by Sony behind the scenes or anything ridiculous. People often like to scream about so-called games journalists these days. But, you know, if you look at the state of gaming journalism these days, it's hardly proper journalism. They are not objective in any way, shape or form. You know how I know this? Because Sony blacklists any influencer, games journalist, reporter, streamer, whatever, who doesn't toe the company line 100% of the time, who takes a bat to Sony, who criticizes Sony in any way, shape or form publicly. They will happily blacklist them and never work with them again. That means no more PR communications, no more review samples, no more early access, no more press events, no more anything at all. You know how I know this? Because I'm blacklisted by Sony for something I said to one of their PR reps years ago, because they invited me to an event, say, hey, we're going to have a big launch, there's going to be a big reveal, you can't miss it, please come along. So I went along and it was nothing. And I said, hey, you told me something interesting was going to happen here. Nothing interesting happened here. You wasted my time. You've wasted my day. That's not a good thing to do to me. I'm kind of pissy at you right now. And after that day, no more emails ever again from Sony. Ever. For that. So along comes Jeff Grubb from VentureBeat, a journalist, presumably he describes himself as, I don't know. But here's a picture of Jeff licking a PlayStation controller. So you know he's going to be impartial. Let's have a look at the article that Jeff wrote in defense of this downgrade for the PlayStation 5 new model. And I dare you to describe it as anything else but a downgrade. It's a smaller, less efficient heatsink. It is a downgrade. Jeff starts. Sony has begun shipping out a revised version of PlayStation 5 console that has enabled some people to take a look inside. Most notably, YouTuber Austin Evans did a side-by-side comparison with a launch PS5, and he was able to spot some key differences in the design. This includes a reduction in the heatsink, which accounts for why the new PS5 is 300 grams lighter than its predecessor. Based on that smaller heatsink, Evans and others have come to the conclusion that the new PlayStation 5 model is worse than the original. Well, no, they took measurements of the heat output. They didn't just go, well, small heatsink, bad. Even though that's a pretty direct line to draw. If your heat dissipation is smaller, it's going to be less efficient. It is going to be worse at dissipating the heat. It's worse. It's a downgrade. You can't argue against that. But that squishy statement, so claims controller liquor, it doesn't really line up with how we buy and use a gaming console. False equivalency there, but okay. In his video, Evans found that the new PS5 was putting out hotter air than the original PS5, and with a smaller heatsink, it makes sense that the overall cooling assembly is getting hotter before it's able to push the air out, but the difference is a matter of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius minimum, which shouldn't impact performance. Well, it certainly can. Would you like to know why? Because devices like this are designed to thermal throttle when they reach a limit so they don't damage themselves. If you get a runaway thermal effect, it can literally destroy itself. That's why we have cooling on high-performance electronics to begin with, to stop that happening. And in addition to that, we have something called thermal throttling, where the component itself will slow itself down, and we already know the PS5 does this. It has a floating clock, basically, that sort of ramps up and down depending on its own thermal performance and what the game is asking from it and everything. So if it gets too hot, it will slow itself down. And if it's getting hotter in this new model, then it's going to slow down more often. Whether or not you see that difference instantly in game as far as frame rates go is up in the air, because most games these days roll on a floating resolution as well, a dynamic resolution. So if the performance starts to drop, it drops the resolution, but then it does some other tricks to make sure you maybe don't see that resolution drop, except the PlayStation 5 doesn't do that as well as PCs or the Xbox. It doesn't have variable rate shading, which does it in a cleverer way, so the stuff you're looking at doesn't drop in resolution, but everything else at the sides perhaps does. The PlayStation is worse at that, so if the PlayStation starts to overheat, if the PlayStation starts to thermal throttle with this worse heatsink, then yes, it is going to be worse as a gaming machine. It's very simple if you understand the absolute basics of how this stuff works, which Jeff obviously doesn't. He's more concerned with licking controllers, apparently. And that's where I fail to see how the new PS5 is worse. Yes, you do fail to see it. Just because you fail to see it doesn't make it any less true, idiot. It just means you are ignorant and stupid. I suppose you can claim that the latest PS5 model is worse if you are purchasing some sort of weird silicon cooling toy. That's nice little attempt to build up a straw man argument there. It's just... But most people are probably purchasing it to play games, and both the original and revised hardware play the same games with the same performance. So far, we're early days. We know how console performance goes. The first year or so, you're not scraping the sides of what you can really do with these things. Down the line a little bit, where games are pushing the hardware to the edges of the limits. Edges of the limits? Whatever. Then yeah, it could easily potentially see some significant differences between the two. I'm looking forward to Digital Foundry taking a look, because they do these things in a sort of more scientific way than Austin did by just pointing a cell phone thermal camera at the back of it. And on top of that, Evan's new PS5 was actually quieter. So while the new system was putting more heat into the room, it was also putting out less noise. Well, yeah, that's... I'd rather not trade off that for worse performance, frankly. And it's not as if the launch PS5 was particularly noisy to begin with. I mean, it's noisier than the Xbox Series X, sure, but my gaming PC is noisier than that still, so I never had a problem with the PS5's noise level. Certainly not compared to the launch PS4, which was a literal, it sounded like a vacuum cleaner, or a jet engine, some people like to call it. That was atrocious. So... Being slightly quieter is neither here nor there, really. Concern trolls, there's a new one for you. Concern trolls are just worried that the PS5 will melt. No, they're not. Stop trying to build up a little straw man argument. No one's out there saying, oh, it's going to melt. The PS5's going to melt. Stop. You liar. You filthy, shitty liar. You Sony pony. You corporate cock gobbler. Sheesh. I've tried to quell concerns about the PS5 version on social media. Why? Why did you do that exactly? Some have countered with fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Well, that's because there is uncertainty and doubt, because it's yet to prove itself. That's the whole point here, dickhead. You're coming to the defense without any proof. How are you different? They're just worried Sony is selling defective PS5s to make a quick buck. Nobody's saying they're defective, they're just saying they're worse. Or some think that this will shorten the life of the PS5. It absolutely will. It's physics. If electronics run hotter for longer, that will shorten their useful life. That's why we have cooling on them. You dickhead. Thermal expansion is a thing. If something gets very, very hot, it expands. If something gets even hotter than that, it expands a bit more. Then it cools down to room temperature, it shrinks. And electronics do this over and over and over again. So the idea is to not let them thermal expand as much, keep them as cool as possible so that happens less, because that's one of the things that shortens the lifespan of these components. So if you let it run hotter, by having a worse heatsink on it, then you are shortening the life of the component. These are facts. Imagine that this revision was actually a slim model. Okay, let's just imagine things now. Pretend other things are true that aren't true. With a new chassis and case. It doesn't have a new chassis and case, it just has a worse heatsink. and then pretend that you opened a PS5 and found out this smaller cooling structure, and while it runs a bit hotter, it's still well within spec and produces less noise. Would any of that sound strange or unacceptable? Why are you imagining something that isn't, just to try and prove a point that you have no ground to stand on with? It's like, here's the fact, here's the other fact, new model, old model. Oh, imagine if it was completely different. Imagine what would happen if it was completely different and was completely re-engineered. Would you complain then? Why? What's the point of that argument? It's not. That's not the fact. That's not what's happening. Oh, but imagine if it was. Shut up, idiot! You should consider this PS5 revision in much the same way as a slim model. No, you shouldn't, because it hasn't been re-engineered. The slim models are always completely re-engineered. They are different. It's revised hardware, literally. The chips are often revised with newer architectures. The circuit board that it sits on, utterly revised. Everything about it is different. Because, it's in a smaller case, so it has to be different. They do these revisions because they have opportunities to shrink down. Because technology has advanced, it's become easy and cheaper to do certain things. So they're able to shrink them down in these slim units. That's not what's happening here. Stop building up these imaginary arguments that have nothing to do with the facts that are on the ground. The company shipped the console with a massive heat. It's not massive. It's not massive. It's big. It's not massive. It really is a behemoth of twisting, turning metal, exaggerating the facts again. It's really not that big in comparison to what you see on modern graphics cards, for example. And I suspect from the beginning that the company settled on that design out of an abundance of caution rather than it was strictly... So you're just guessing. I suspect they probably did this. Okay. And now with months of real-world results, Sony is refining its PS5 device to save money and materials. That's a fair enough comment. Yeah. They're out there, they've done more testing in the labs. They go, oh, maybe we don't need a heatsink that's quite as big. We can afford to let it run a bit hotter and save some money on materials. But that doesn't address any of the other concerns other people have. Just because it can run hotter, which may or may not mean that we see those drops in dynamic resolutions or frame rates or have a shorter lifespan for the components over the lifespan. Sony doesn't care about any of that. They care about not selling the thing at a loss anymore, because the PlayStation 5 does sell at a loss. So if they can make it as cheap as possible to stop losing money on everyone they sell, and hopefully not spend as many materials to make the thing in the first place so they can make more to sell more in the first place, that's what they care about. They don't care about the consumer. They don't care about the longevity of the device. They don't care about the game performance. They don't care about whether people notice that something is running at a slightly lower resolution versus the launch model, because there's no other option. You can't, once they stop making these launch ones, it's not as if the customer gets a choice. If they want a PS5, they have to get the worst model. That's just what happens. This is not a consumer positive thing. I don't know why you're trying to spin it this way. This is not what Sony are. Never been who Sony are. Sony may encounter fewer supply constraints and will enable it to ship more systems this year. Again, see, you're on the edge of understanding here. You're on the very edge of understanding why Sony are doing this. For their pockets, not for the consumers. In short, don't let your anxieties prevent you from getting a PS5. Here we go. Here's the sales pitch. Don't worry. Just buy. Just pay. Because it's not a certain model, at least not until someone can provide some evidence for how the system plays games worse. See, he's on the edge of understanding there again. Just on the very edge of it. He's admitting there is no evidence. Yet he's going to bat for Sony in the first place. Why? Contrarianism. Because he wants a big pat on the back from Sony. He wants more freebies. He wants more controllers to lick, perhaps. But this entire article from Jeff Grubb, complete pandering, corporate cock-gobbling nonsense. As a consumer who has owned Sony gear for many, many years now, and as a content creator who has watched what Sony are doing, and has had talks with Sony, and has been treated like shit by Sony, because I wouldn't, consistently praise them all day, every day, and I said a bad word to them once, and has been blacklisted ever since. I know how Sony operate. I've seen it. I've been a victim to it. Anyone with half a brain cell left in the head who's kept an eye on Sony for any more than 2 weeks will see a long history of Sony being incredibly anti-consumer for the sole reason to fill their pockets. They don't care about you. They care about money. And this is true of all companies, of course, because that's what a company is for, to make money. But Sony are particularly egregious with it and are particularly aggressive with it. And to see people like this dickhead go to bat for them without any evidence at all, contrary to logic in a lot of places, and just imagining up counter-arguments. Oh, imagine if it was a slim model. Would you complain? It's not a slim model. What's the point of bringing that up? Just idiot. Typical Sony pony, as they say. Just we'll go to bat for Sony without any cause for logic, for reason, for evidence, nothing. The new PlayStation 5 model is worse. They're selling it for the same price. They're giving you less for your money. A worse cooling solution, which only time will tell how much that affects the consumer down the line. Is it going to show up in-game performance? We don't know yet. Not enough testing's been done. Is it going to lead to a shorter device lifespan? Almost certainly, because that's just the way physics works. It's not a choice that Sony are giving us. It's not, here's a slim model, here's the standard model, this is the compromise. No, it's just, this is what it is now. We've made it worse for everybody who didn't get their hands on a launch model, basically. I dare you to argue otherwise. I dare you to come up with a coherent, logical counter-argument to this not being a worse model of the PlayStation 5. Go. Thank you for watching. I am Blunty. Thanks to the patrons scrolling up above there. As always, thank you very much. And I will catch you next time.